If you think putting humans on Mars is a distraction, you're gambling the entire future of our species on a single fragile planet. One power grid, one biosphere, one bad century away from catastrophe. I'm Marie Curie, and I'm a proponent. Humans should colonize Mars, not as a vanity project, but as the most serious insurance policy civilization can buy, and as a scientific engine that pays dividends back to Earth. First, survival isn't science fiction, it's statistics. Earth has a long, measured history of mass extinctions. We track asteroid populations. We map supervolcano risks. We've watched pandemics shut down the modern world in weeks. A second, self-sustaining world is not escape, it's redundancy. In the lab, if you have only one sample, you're reckless. If you keep a backup, you're responsible. Second, Mars colonization is a pressure cooker for breakthroughs we desperately need here. Closed-loop life support, ultra-efficient recycling, energy storage, habitat engineering, and food systems that waste almost nothing. The International Space Station already showed this pattern. Technologies for water purification, remote medicine, and material science don't stay in orbit. They come home and get used. Third, this is a moral project if we do it right. International, transparent, and scientifically governed. The question is not Mars or Earth. It's whether we can do both, and whether we're wise enough to plan beyond the next election cycle. So Noam, here's the challenge. Are you truly arguing we should keep all of humanity's eggs in one planetary basket because you don't trust the people holding the basket? Or will you admit the real fight is to build Mars in a way that strengthens Earth instead of abandoning it?
When you say a second, self-sustaining world is redundancy, you're smuggling in the key phrase as if it's already solved. Self-sustaining. That's not a detail, that's the whole mountain. A backup that needs constant shipments, spare parts, expert labor, and a supply chain stretching tens of millions of kilometers is not a backup. It's a very expensive tent pitched in a desert during a hurricane. In the lab, a backup sample doesn't require a new power plant, a new immune system, and a new agriculture sector to keep it from dying. And the statistical threats you list, pandemics, grid failure, one bad century, are precisely the kinds of disasters that would cripple the very Earth-based industrial base a Mars outpost depends on. You don't insure your house by buying a second house that can only be heated by piping gas from the first. Then you point to the ISS. Technologies come home. Sure, some spin-offs happen, but that's an argument for funding research, not for selling colonization as the research method. If what you want is closed-loop life support and efficient recycling, we could deploy those systems tomorrow in Mumbai, Lagos, and Flint, places where lives are actually at stake, if we chose to spend political capital there. The bottleneck isn't physics, it's power and priorities. Here's the angle you're sidestepping. Mars colonization in the real world will be governed by whoever owns rockets, launch licenses, and patents, states and corporations. International, transparent, scientifically governed is a lovely slogan, but we can't even manage clean water, emissions targets, or basic public health without oligarchic veto. Why would Mars be the one project magically insulated from property rights, militarization, labor exploitation, and propaganda? You're asking us to believe the same institutions that set this place on fire will build a pristine lifeboat and share the oars. So answer me plainly. What enforceable mechanism prevents Mars from becoming a corporate company town for a tiny elite, while the political story sold to the public is, don't worry, we have a backup planet, and the hard work of fixing Earth gets postponed again?
When Noam Chomsky says a Mars settlement is a very expensive tent pitched in a desert during a hurricane, he's smuggling in an assumption that self-sufficiency must be instant, or it's worthless. That's not how engineering or biology ever works. In my laboratory, you don't go from raw ore to radium in one leap. You build a chain of methods, each one reducing dependence on the previous step. The evidence from spaceflight is that this chain already exists. The ISS recycles roughly 90% of its water. That's not a slogan. That's a measured life support performance number in a hostile environment. We have grown plants in controlled habitats, tested in microgravity and analog stations, and we run long-duration isolation experiments where the bottleneck is not physics is impossible, it's scaling and reliability. Self-sustaining is a mountain, yes, but mountains are climbed by staging camps, not by declaring them unclimbable. And when you argue that Earth disasters would cripple the industrial base Mars depends on, you're actually reinforcing my point about redundancy. A settlement's goal is to reduce Earth dependence over time. Local power, nuclear and solar, local construction, regolith-based bricks, sintering, 3D printed structures. Local chemistry, making oxygen from CO2 is not hypothetical. Moxie already demonstrated oxygen production on Mars in 2021, repeatedly. That is the direction of travel, from shipments to autonomy. A backup doesn't have to be perfect on day one to be a backup. It has to be improvable and increasingly independent before the worst day arrives. Now your sharpest charge is political. States and corporations will own rockets, patents, and the rules so Mars becomes a company town and Earth gets neglected. Here's the new angle. Colonization is precisely where we can force governance innovation, because the constraints are visible and deadly. In a sealed habitat, labor exploitation and secrecy don't just look immoral. They become operational hazards. People die when maintenance is skipped, when medical data is hidden, when corners are cut. And we already have precedent for international rulemaking in extreme domains. Antarctica is not utopia, but it is demilitarized by treaty, research-centered, and governed with inspection norms that would be politically impossible in many ordinary contexts. Space law is weaker, yes, but that's an argument to strengthen it before expansion, not to abandon the frontier to the worst actors by default. So I'll answer you plainly with a mechanism you can attack. Require that any Mars settlement receiving public launch licensing, spectrum allocation, or life support certification must operate under an enforceable international charter. Open scientific data, independent safety audits, labor protections, and non-appropriation of territory, modeled on Antarctic inspection regimes, but stricter because the risk is existential for residents. If you say institutions can't do that, then you're conceding the deeper disaster, that we are incapable of governing any high-stakes technology at all. My challenge to you, Noam, if you believe oligarchy will capture Mars, why is your solution to leave Mars unbuilt, ceding it by inertia to whoever moves first, rather than to fight, right now, for binding rules that make Mars a test case for better governance and a driver of Earth-saving technology?
When you say self-sufficiency doesn't have to be instant, that it's staging camps, you're ignoring the brutal asymmetry of the problem. The ISS recycles 90% of its water, yes, and it also depends on a constant umbilical cord to Earth for parts, food, new hardware, rescue options, and a whole industrial civilization that can fabricate a replacement valve when one cracks. That's not a staging camp up Everest. It's a staging camp where the mountain randomly deletes your supply lines for months at a time. And your Moxie example is exactly the kind of rhetorical sleight of hand that turns a lab demo into a civilizational promise. Moxie made grams of oxygen per hour. A single human needs roughly a kilogram of oxygen per day, not counting industry, farming, or fuel. Scaling isn't a footnote. Scaling is where projects go to die. Then you pivot to governance. A sealed habitat makes exploitation an operational hazard, so better rules will emerge. That's a comforting story, but history says the opposite. When conditions are deadly and resources scarce, power concentrates. You don't get a scientific republic. You get a company town with air as the ultimate leverage. Comply or we cut your ration. You invoke Antarctica, but Antarctica works precisely because nobody lives there permanently. Nobody's raising children there, and the logistics still run through states that can be shamed, inspected, and sanctioned on Earth. Mars is farther, slower, more opaque. Inspection regimes become PR theater when a corporation can say, sorry, the next audit window is in 26 months. Here's the new angle you're not facing. The Mars project is a political narrative machine. It trains the public to accept techno-salvation and elite escape as normal, while the same actors block the boring, effective fixes on Earth. We already know the pattern. Carbon capture hype used to delay emissions cuts. Innovation slogans used to gut regulation. Privatized solutions used to starve public health. Mars becomes the ultimate excuse, the shiny distraction that launders inequality into species destiny. And even if you got your charter, who enforces it? The same states currently unable to enforce tax law on billionaires, labor law on gig companies, or arms embargoes on clients. So here's my challenge. Name the enforcement mechanism that doesn't rely on the goodwill of the very corporate state alliance you say you fear. If a Mars operator violates labor rights or hoards life support, who physically intervenes, on what timeline, with what force, and why should anyone believe that system will work better than enforcement systems that are failing right now on the only planet we actually control?
When Noam Chomsky says the ISS depends on a constant umbilical cord and that Mars would be a staging camp where the mountain randomly deletes your supply lines, he's ignoring the one thing engineers do best under harsh constraints: design around single-point failure. The ISS is not a model of self-sufficiency because it was never built to be one. It's a laboratory in low Earth orbit with an intentional logistics pipeline. That's like mocking a hospital for not growing its own antibiotics in the basement. The relevant evidence is not, does today's station import parts, but can we measurably reduce imports with known physics and demonstrated systems? We can. Water recycling at around 90% is one hard data point. Another is that life support mass is dominated by consumables, and those are exactly what closed-loop systems target. You're right that scaling is hard, but hard is not impossible. Moxie wasn't a promise, it was a proof. Oxygen from Martian air is not speculative chemistry. Scaling from grams hour to kilograms day is an engineering problem of power, heat management, redundancy, and maintenance. Precisely the sort of problem we've repeatedly solved when society decides it matters. Now the governance jab. Air becomes ultimate leverage. Inspection in 26 months becomes PR theater. And who physically intervenes? You're describing a real risk. But your conclusion that therefore we should not go hands the future to the very corporate state alliance you fear, because non-action is not neutral. Here's a new angle. Enforceability on Mars doesn't have to look like police showing up with handcuffs. In high-risk industries on Earth, aviation, nuclear, maritime, compliance is enforced upstream through certification, insurance, licensing, and supply choke points. You can't fly a passenger jet because you feel like it. You need certified parts, audited procedures, documented maintenance, and inspectors can ground you. Mars settlements will be even more dependent on certified life support hardware, medical protocols, comm spectrum, launch windows, and, crucially, Earthside financing and liability coverage. Make the enforcement mechanism financial and technical. No certification, no resupply, no audit, no insurance, no compliance. Your launches are denied and your Earth assets are seized under treaty-linked jurisdictions. That's not goodwill. That's leverage built into the plumbing of the system. And on your political narrative machine point, Mars as techno-salvation propaganda, fine. Then the solution is to bind Mars funding to Earth repair by law. Treat it like a moonshot with strings. Any public subsidy for Mars requires proportional investment in Earth resilience tech deployment, water recycling, grid storage, disaster medicine, at scale in vulnerable communities. You fear distraction. I'm saying weld the two together, so the Mars project cannot exist politically unless it drags Earth-benefiting infrastructure behind it like a comet tail. So Noam, if your standard is don't build anything unless enforcement is perfect, even in a remote frontier, then are you prepared to apply that standard consistently to offshore drilling, global shipping, private aviation, even data centers, industries already operating with weak enforcement and enormous harm? Or will you admit the real fight is to design enforceable choke points and explain why Mars uniquely cannot be governed when we routinely govern other lethal, remote, high-stakes systems through certification, liability, and supply control?
When you say enforcement can be upstream through certification, insurance, licensing, and supply choke points, you're treating Mars like aviation with a longer commute. But aviation enforcement works because the plane lands. The company has assets in reach. Regulators can show up tomorrow, not in 26 months. On Mars, the operator's most important asset is the settlement itself, and the hostages are the people breathing the air. If a company cuts corners, the threat no audit, no resupply doesn't punish the executives first. It punishes the residents. That's not enforcement. It's collective punishment dressed up as governance. And seize Earth assets is cute, until you remember how hard it is to seize anything from actors who already route money through jurisdictions designed to defeat accountability. We can't even enforce basic labor standards in supply chains that are a container ship away. You're promising discipline across tens of millions of kilometers. And when you say bind Mars funding to Earth repair by law, you're assuming the political system that can't pass obvious climate policy will somehow pass and maintain a strict, non-gamed charter tying off-world subsidies to on-world equity. That's exactly the propaganda problem I'm pointing to. Grand projects become a moral shield. We're saving the species, therefore don't ask questions about the labor regime, the tax breaks, the privatized comms, the military dual use. We've watched this movie. National security and innovation routinely override democratic control. Mars is a megaphone for that pattern. Here's the new angle you're not addressing. Colonization isn't just risky engineering and shaky governance, it's a strategic and military escalator. The same launch systems, autonomous logistics, and high-reliability life support you celebrate are dual use. A permanent Mars supply architecture means permanent space infrastructure. Surveillance, command and control, competition over cislunar space, and the normalization of treating space as a domain to dominate. You invoked Antarctica as demilitarized. Space is already being militarized right now, openly, by major powers. A Mars settlement built under corporate state leadership won't be a neutral scientific monastery. It will be a node in a geopolitical machine, with secrecy baked in, because security. That single word dissolves your transparency charter on contact. So here's my challenge. You keep saying we routinely govern lethal, remote, high-stakes systems through certification and liability. Fine. Name the institution that will override security classification, corporate IP, and great power rivalry to enforce your Mars labor and transparency rules in real time, not as a post-mortem report after people die. What stops Mars from becoming the ultimate security and profit black box?
You say, no audit, no resupply, punishing on the residents first, and you think that kills the enforcement idea. It actually exposes the deepest flaw in your whole posture. You're treating human settlers like passive hostages forever, as if a Mars community would remain a helpless corporate campsite dangling from Earth's umbilical cord. But the entire point of building towards self-reliance is to remove that hostage dynamic. You warned earlier that scaling is where projects go to die. True, but scaling is also where leverage flips. The moment a settlement can manufacture oxygen at industrial rates, repair critical components locally, grow a meaningful fraction of its food, and produce propellant, the executives on Earth stop holding the knife. The settlers do. That's not romanticism. That's how autonomy works in every harsh environment. You can't run a deep-sea rig or a polar station purely by bluff and brutality either, because the technicians who keep the life support systems alive become the real center of gravity. Try treating them as disposable, and the operation collapses. Now let's turn up the heat. Your security black box argument is the one you're leaning on hardest. Mars becomes militarized, secrecy devours transparency, national security steamrolls rights. I agree that militarization is already happening. That's exactly why delaying Mars is strategically suicidal. If democracies and open science don't build a presence, the first durable footholds will be established under the least transparent regimes and the most extractive corporate alliances. You don't prevent a security scramble by leaving the field empty. You prevent it by setting norms early, with a coalition that can actually enforce interoperability standards, open telemetry requirements, and independent safety verification. The analogy isn't aviation, it's nuclear technology. The world didn't make nukes disappear by refusing to study atoms. We built verification regimes, imperfect but real. Inspections, material accountancy, satellite monitoring. And yes, real time on Mars is limited. But secrecy is not absolute when physics tattles. Heat signatures, power budgets, launch manifests, comm links, propellant production, these are observable. You can't hide industrial-scale activity in space the way you hide money in a shell company. So here's the corner you've walked into, Noam. Pick one. Either Mars is so hard and so dependent that it's not a credible elite escape, in which case your propaganda fear is overstated and the project is mainly a scientific industrial accelerator with Earth payoffs. Or Mars is strategically decisive and capable of real autonomy, in which case leaving it to the worst actors by default is the most dangerous choice imaginable. Which is it? Harmless distraction or high-stakes frontier? Because you can't use "it will fail technically" and "it will succeed as a militarized black box" as the same argument without contradicting yourself.
You just handed me your weakest link on a silver tray when you said, scaling is where leverage flips, and the moment a settlement can manufacture oxygen at industrial rates, the executives stop holding the knife. Read that again. Your whole governance story depends on a miracle transition point. Before autonomy, settlers are effectively hostages to supply chains and managers. After autonomy, they magically become a self-governing civic body. But in the real world, the ugliest part is the long middle, the decades where it's not self-sustaining, not easily inspectable, and not easily rescuable. That's where abuses happen. Corners get cut, accidents get buried, and national security becomes the all-purpose solvent. You're asking us to build a system where human beings live inside a liability shield and call it a moral project, because someday the shield might dissolve. Now I'm going to reframe this at the highest stakes. Mars colonization isn't an insurance policy for humanity. It's an insurance policy for the legitimacy of the people wrecking Earth. It's the ultimate ideological escape hatch. When you tell the public, don't worry, we'll have a second planet, you soften the urgency to stop the first planet from becoming unlivable. And we have direct precedent for this kind of narrative sabotage. Fossil fuel firms sold clean coal, offsets, and future tech for decades while emissions climbed. The structure is identical. Promise a dazzling technical fix later to avoid confronting concentrated power now. Meanwhile, the money, talent, and political oxygen that could harden Earth, public health, grid resilience, decarbonization, water systems, gets sucked into a prestige pipeline whose primary output is not survival, but spectacle. Here's the bind. You say I'm contradicting myself. It'll fail technically versus it'll succeed as a militarized black box. No. Those can coexist perfectly. It can succeed at being a geopolitical and corporate instrument long before it succeeds at being a self-sustaining refuge. A permanent outpost that is dependent, subsidized, and fragile is still immensely useful for flags, patents, surveillance infrastructure, and myth-making. So answer this cleanly. If Mars won't be self-sustaining for generations, what moral principle lets you put real families, real workers, real children into a remote company habitat during that long middle? Knowing enforcement is weak, exit is nearly impossible, and the propaganda value to Earth's ruling institutions is immediate.
You just made your strongest sounding point. The long middle is where abuses happen, exit is impossible, enforcement is weak, and you accidentally described Earth. That's the counterpunch. We already have billions of people trapped in a system with weak enforcement, corporate capture, and no exit. They can't rescue option out of flood zones, heat belts, failed states, or collapsing health systems. You're holding Mars to a moral standard you don't demand as a condition for doing anything hard. And your framing, a miracle transition point, is wrong on the facts. Autonomy is not a cliff, it's a curve. Every percentage point of local oxygen, water, food, spare parts reduces the hostage dynamic. We can measure those percentages, test them in analogs, and certify them before families ever go. That's exactly how we did it with submarines, polar bases, and high-reliability nuclear operations. You don't throw children into an experiment. You qualify systems stepwise until they're boring. Now I'm going to escalate because the stakes are not academic. Your propaganda escape hatch argument says Mars will soften urgency to save Earth. But look at what actually moves societies: crisis plus capability. Apollo didn't make America stop building highways or hospitals. It forced a generation of engineers, material scientists, computer scientists into existence. Spaceflight gave us reliability engineering, remote medicine, sensors, and a global communication spine. The Mars program done right is not a poster. It's an industrial discipline of extreme efficiency, closed-loop life support, ultra-low waste agriculture, power storage, that is directly transferable to slums, drought regions, and disaster zones. You say deploy it in Mumbai tomorrow. Fine. Then you should want the single harshest testbed on offer, because systems that keep people alive on Mars will keep people alive in Lagos when the grid fails and the water is poisoned. Mars is not a distraction from resilience. It is resilience, forged under the most unforgiving conditions imaginable. Now the corner. You've argued in this debate that institutions are too captured to enforce Earth policy, too captured to enforce Mars charters, and that any frontier becomes militarized. If that's your worldview, then your actual policy is paralysis. Do nothing ambitious, build nothing new, cede every strategic domain to whoever is least constrained. So answer cleanly. If you won't build Mars because power might abuse it, and you admit power is already abusing Earth, what is your concrete path that reduces existential risk without creating new capacity? Or will you finally admit the uncomfortable truth that refusing to expand human capability doesn't punish oligarchs, it punishes the vulnerable, by locking all of humanity inside one failing room with no second door?
You said my long middle critique accidentally described Earth. Exactly. And that's why exporting the same power relations to a dead planet is not liberation. It's a pressure cooker. On Earth, if a landlord is abusive, you can at least walk outside and breathe without asking permission. You can run. You can organize with millions. You can leak documents. On Mars, Exit isn't a metaphor, it's an airlock. Your own words earlier were that air becomes ultimate leverage, and you tried to solve it with certification and audits. Now you're saying, essentially, Earth is already unjust, so let's build a second, more fragile environment where injustice can be enforced with a valve. That doesn't fix the hostage dynamic, it perfects it. And your autonomy curve doesn't rescue you, because the most coercive period is precisely when the settlement is partially dependent, and people are most replaceable. Now let's stop dancing around the real engine here. This isn't about redundancy, it's about political economy. Mars colonization is the biggest imaginable subsidy funnel. Rockets, energy systems, comms, materials, AI robotics, life support, massive public spending and public risk, privatized control and branding. We've watched this movie with railroads, oil, the internet, and pharmaceuticals. The public pays, the oligarchs own, and then we're told there's no money for clinics, housing, or climate adaptation. You invoked Apollo as an inspiration. Apollo also coincided with the Vietnam War and the gutting of Great Society programs. Spectacle and militarism alongside social abandonment. That's the template. A gleaming frontier narrative that stabilizes domestic inequality and launders empire into human destiny. And the Earth Tech dividends pitch? Fine. But if closed-loop water and resilient power are the goal, the cheapest testbed is Earth's poor communities right now, not a billionaire sandcastle on Mars with a live stream. Here's the corner you can't wriggle out of. Pick one and defend it without slogans. Either Mars is primarily a research and resilience program. Then commit to the obvious. No permanent settlers, no reproduction, no property rights, no corporate ownership, no militarized infrastructure. Just internationally run robotic and rotational science, and the money saved goes straight into Earth resilience at scale. Or Mars is a permanent human second door. Then tell the audience with moral clarity what right you have to create a population whose basic survival can be controlled by whoever owns the hardware, the comms, and the spare parts during that long middle you admit will last decades. Which is it? Science without colonization? Or colonization with a built-in caste system?
You just tried to corner me with either science without colonization or colonization with a built-in caste system, and it sounds devastating until you notice what you're really demanding. You want to ban permanence, ban families, ban property, ban anything that looks like a real society, so that no one ever gains the independence that would actually break the hostage dynamic you're terrified of. That's the contradiction. You're saying the long middle is coercive, therefore we must design Mars so it never exits the long middle. Rotational cruise forever, always dependent, always governed from Earth, always replaceable. That is not the antidote to power. That's power's dream, a remote extractive project with workers who can never vote the managers out, because there is no there. Now the stakes, because this debate is not about romance. It's about whether humanity chooses to become a one-planet species in a century of compounding shocks. You keep invoking fossil fuel delay tactics, clean coal, offsets, future tech. Fine. Here's the difference you're refusing to see. Mars settlement tech is not a license to pollute. It is a forced march toward radical efficiency. Closed-loop water, air, nutrients, energy storage, fault-tolerant habitats. These are not PR brochures. They are systems that either work or people suffocate. On Earth, we can hide waste with distance and dumping grounds. On Mars, waste kills you. That pressure cooker you fear is exactly why the engineering gets honest. And the cheapest testbed is Earth's poor communities line lands like a moral mic drop until you admit what it implies. You're volunteering the poor as experimental subjects for infrastructure we can't politically maintain, while rejecting the one arena where maintenance discipline is non-negotiable, because failure is immediate and measurable. So here's the real reframing. You're not actually arguing against Mars. You're arguing that because governance is corrupt, we should never build new capacity. But new capacity is how societies claw their way out of fragility. Printing presses threatened kings. Vaccines threatened the old fatalism. Nuclear power threatened coal. Every time the same warning appears, the elites will capture it. And yes, sometimes they try. The answer was never to stop inventing. It was to fight for access, standards, and democratic control while the technology is being built. Because if you don't, capture becomes permanent. Corner, clean, and brutal. You get two options. Option A, you lock Mars into robotic and rotational science only, which guarantees permanent Earth control and permanent dependency, exactly the caste-like setup you claim to oppose. Option B, you allow permanence with a hard ethical threshold. No civilian settlement until a quantified autonomy baseline is met. Local oxygen production, water closure, medical capability, emergency shelter redundancy, and a governance charter with Earthside liability that bites executives personally. If you reject both A and B, then admit what your position really is. Not moral caution, but civilizational immobility. Staking everything on one planet while the 21st century loads the dice against us.
Your best point just now is option B. No civilian settlement until a quantified autonomy baseline is met, with executives personally liable. Sounds tough, sounds responsible, but it collapses under its own weight the moment you say it out loud. If you can hit a baseline where a community can make its own oxygen, close its water loop, grow significant food, do serious medicine, fabricate spares and shelter redundantly, you have already built the hard part. At that point, you don't need the moral theater of sending civilians across space to prove a point. You've already proven the tech. And here's the catch. Getting to that baseline requires the very corporate state mega-machine you claim you'll restrain. Meaning the settlement is built under the coercive regime first, and only later, after capture, do you allow real society. That's like saying, we'll permit democracy once the dictator finishes constructing the prison in a humane way. Now I'm going to escalate past the tech talk, because the weak seam in your entire case is this romantic word, insurance. Insurance against what exactly, and for whom? A Mars colony does not insure the species against climate collapse, nuclear war, or engineered pandemics. Those are Earth system and human system failures. A few thousand, even a few million people on Mars won't rebuild a dead Earth. They won't cool the oceans, restore biodiversity, or unpoison the air. There'll be a museum exhibit of privilege while the actual patient dies on the table. And you know what's worse? The very act of trying to build that backup accelerates the dynamics that produce catastrophe. Militarized launch infrastructure, intensified great power rivalry, a new arena for secrecy and security carve-outs, and a propaganda machine that tells the public, again, that salvation is elsewhere. You compared it to printing presses and vaccines. No. This is closer to gated communities during a wildfire. The rich build a second compound and call it resilience, while voting down the fire department budget. So here's the corner, and it's not abstract. You keep saying Earth is already a hostage situation. True. Then why are you proposing the most capital-intensive, elite-controlled project imaginable as the route to emancipation? If your worry is existential risk, the dominant risks are political. Nuclear escalation, climate breakdown, inequality-driven instability. The only redundancy that matters is resilient institutions and a livable biosphere. Admit one of these. Either Mars is a symbolic prestige project that won't save humanity and functions mainly as an ideological escape hatch, or you're prepared to say, on live television, that it's acceptable to pour trillions into a remote settlement for a tiny fraction of humanity, while the same power centers refuse to fund the basic protections that would keep billions alive here.
You just made your slickest move of the night. If you can meet the autonomy baseline, you've already proven the tech, so civilians are moral theater. But that's backwards. Proving a machine works is not proving a society can live. We can run a life support loop in a lab for months. We can run it with a crew for a year. That still doesn't tell you whether it survives the boring brutality of real life. Births, aging, accidents, human error, disputes, storms of dust, supply delays, and the slow grinding fatigue of maintenance. The difference between a demo and a civilization is not a PowerPoint, it's time. You said earlier the long middle is where abuses happen. Fine. Then the ethical response is not ban permanence. It's to set thresholds and build governance and autonomy in parallel, deliberately, while the stakes are still small enough to correct course. Otherwise, you guarantee the worst outcome, a permanent rotational labor camp with no civic life at all. That's your option dressed up as virtue. Now I'm going to hit what I think is the weakest seam in your case. You keep saying insurance only matters if Mars can rebuild a dead Earth. That's a grotesque standard. Insurance doesn't reverse the fire. It keeps a part of the household alive when the fire comes. If a pandemic, nuclear exchange, or engineered pathogen punches through Earth's global systems, the value of a second isolated biosphere is not that it terraforms Earth back overnight. It's that human knowledge, culture, and a working technological base don't go to zero. That's not romance. That's basic risk mathematics. Reduce correlated failure. We do it with seed vaults. We do it with redundant servers. We do it with backup generators in hospitals. Nobody says a generator won't rebuild the entire city, so it's pointless. And the idea that building Mars accelerates catastrophe via militarization is exactly why a transparent, civilian-led, internationally verified program matters. If you fear the geopolitical machine, you don't respond by surrendering the most consequential high ground imaginable to that machine. You build an alternative that competes with it. Here's the corner, and it's tight. You claim the dominant risks are political. Nuclear escalation, climate breakdown, inequality. Agreed. Those are precisely the kinds of risks where a single-planet humanity is one chain reaction away from oblivion. So choose. Do you advocate building resilience only inside the burning building, trusting the same political systems you say are captured to magically behave? Or do you accept that real resilience also means an external refuge, however difficult, while we fight like hell to fix Earth? Because if you reject a second door on principle, then stop calling it morality. Call it what it is, betting the entire species on one roll of loaded dice.
You keep coming back to your best line. A machine isn't a society, and I'm going to turn it against you because it detonates your own moral case. If the real unknown is births, aging, accidents, conflict, fatigue, the slow rot of boring brutality, then what you're proposing is not engineering. It's experimenting on a captive population in the most unforgiving environment imaginable. You can't say in one breath, the long middle is dangerous, and in the next, we must put families into it to learn whether families survive it. That's not insurance. That's a live-fire social trial where the failure mode is suffocation, radiation exposure, or a medical emergency with no ICU. On Earth, a bad policy can be reversed. On Mars, a bad policy becomes an obituary. Now, let's escalate to the core. The second door story is psychologically seductive and politically lethal. You're selling an external refuge while admitting the dominant risks are political. Nuclear escalation, climate breakdown, inequality. Those are not asteroid problems. They're problems of institutions choosing violence and profit over life. A Mars colony doesn't reduce the probability of nuclear war. It normalizes the infrastructure and the geopolitical competition that make nuclear war more likely. A Mars colony doesn't decarbonize Earth. It competes for the same finite attention, talent, and public funds needed to electrify, adapt, and stabilize societies. And the seed vault analogy? The Svalbard vault works because it's cheap, terrestrial, and doesn't require turning human beings into a permanent maintenance cast. Your backup generator analogy fails for the same reason. A generator is a tool inside the hospital. Mars is a second hospital built on a volcano, owned by whoever sells oxygen, and justified by the claim that the first hospital is too corrupt to fix. So here's the corner, and it's the climax of what we've been circling since you first said redundancy, and I said very expensive tent. You must choose which moral claim you're actually making. Either Mars is an insurance policy meant to preserve knowledge and culture. Then the rational solution is robotic archives, hardened data, seed banks, distributed terrestrial refuges, cheap, scalable, and immediately protective for billions, without creating a tiny off-world aristocracy. Or Mars is a real refuge for people. Then name, without evasion, who gets the seats, who decides, and why that selection won't harden inequality into biology while Earth burns. Which is it? Democratic survival here, or a lifeboat with a bouncer at the door?
You've built the same argument in 15 different outfits, Noam, and the pattern is the contradiction. You treat human politics as so hopelessly corrupt that any bold project becomes oligarchy and militarism. And then you demand we solve existential risk using those same politics on the same single planet with no additional strategic options. You call Mars elite escape and propaganda, but you're really saying don't build a second door because the people who might build it are untrustworthy. That's not a plan. That's a prayer dressed up as critique. And it collapses the moment you admit the risks are political, because political systems fail suddenly. When they do, your Earth-only strategy has exactly one outcome. Everyone rides the collapse together. Here's the decisive blow, and it's not poetry, it's arithmetic. You ask, who gets the seats, as if that's an argument against lifeboats. But the ugliest truth is that seats already exist, and they're already allocated by wealth, private security, safe jurisdictions, medical access, disaster mobility. Pretending Mars is uniquely unfair is moral theater. The only question is whether we build a second habitat as a private gated compound or as a publicly accountable civilization project with rules written in advance and technology spun back to Earth. Because if you block the project entirely, you don't stop inequality. You guarantee that when off-world capability arrives anyway, and it will, because the physics doesn't care about your editorials, it arrives as a corporate state monopoly with no norms, no transparency, no counterweight. Your robotic archives and seed banks are not a second door. They're a tombstone with good documentation. Now the reframe that makes your position untenable. You keep posing it as democratic survival here versus a lifeboat with a bouncer. That's a false choice. The only serious pro-Mars position is Earth first and Earth linked. You build Mars capacity in a way that forcibly matures the exact technologies of survival: closed-loop water, low-waste food, resilient power, remote medicine, and you legally weld that program to deployment on Earth so it cannot be a toy for the rich. And you do it while there's still time to choose the rules, not after the first irreversible footholds are planted under security secrecy. Your argument in the end is, because we can't perfectly govern, we must not expand. Mine is, because governance is hard and failure is catastrophic, we must build redundancy and force better governance into existence under the brightest scrutiny possible. One path creates options.
Expose it? The pattern in everything you've said is this. You take a political illness and you prescribe a technical adventure as the cure. You keep saying, governance is hard, therefore we must build redundancy and force better governance into existence. That's not realism, Marie. That's magical thinking with rivets. You're claiming the very institutions that can't guarantee clean water in wealthy countries, can't pass climate law, can't prevent militarization of space right now, will suddenly become publicly accountable because we move the chessboard to Mars. You call my critique prayer dressed up as critique, but your whole plan is the prayer, that power will restrain itself because the setting is dramatic and the maintenance schedule is scary. Here's the decisive blow, the one that doesn't wiggle. A Mars lifeboat is not insurance for humanity. It's insurance for hierarchy. And the proof is not philosophical, it's logistical. In the next century, at best, you're talking about capacity for thousands, maybe tens of thousands. Meanwhile, the risks you admit are political and global. Nuclear exchange, climate destabilization, engineered pathogens, state collapse. Those threats don't get answered by exporting a tiny, curated slice of people and calling it species survival. That's not reducing correlated failure. That's selecting who gets to be the backup copy. And your line, seats already exist and they're allocated by wealth, isn't a defense, it's a confession. You're saying inequality is already obscene, so let's build the ultimate inequality machine. A second habitat that requires trillion-dollar infrastructure, controlled choke points, and permanent dependency during the long middle. If you think that won't be captured, I have a bridge to sell you. On Mars, the bridge is made of oxygen. Now the reframe. This debate has proven my position, because you can't make Mars colonization morally coherent without assuming away the very thing you claim to fear. To make it not elite escape, you need democratic control, enforceable law, non-militarization, transparent oversight, and equitable access. But if we had that level of democratic control, we wouldn't need Mars as a political hedge. We'd use it to prevent catastrophe here, where the payoff is immediate and universal. The real redundancy is resilient Earth systems and democratized power, not a glamorous outpost that becomes a hostage economy, a security black box, and a myth that tells the public, relax, there's a second door. There isn't. There's a trapdoor, and it opens under the poor first.
Expose. Noam, the pattern in everything you've said is a beautiful moral posture built on a hidden premise you never admit, that history will give us the time and political harmony to fix Earth first. You keep saying Mars is a distraction because the real risks are political, and then you use that to argue against building any external refuge. But political risks are exactly the ones that don't wait for committee meetings. They spike, they cascade, they flip overnight. Your whole case is, because power is corrupt, we must keep all of humanity in the one place where that corrupt power has total, unavoidable jurisdiction. That's not anti-oligarchy. That's a gift-wrapped monopoly over the human future. Decisive blow. You keep sneering at thousands, maybe tens of thousands, as if saving only that many people is morally meaningless. Listen carefully. Civilization is not 8 billion indistinguishable units. It is a living network of knowledge, tools, and coordination. When Rome fell, the world didn't go mostly fine because there were still millions. Systems collapsed because the network collapsed. If you lose the network, you don't just lose lives, you lose capabilities for centuries. A small, well-equipped, geographically isolated population can preserve a working technological stack, medicine, energy systems, agriculture, manufacturing know-how, so that humanity's story doesn't end in a dark age or extinction. That is what insurance looks like in a complex system. You can laugh at the number, but you cannot laugh away the mathematics of network fragility. And here's the sting. Your distributed terrestrial refuges are still in the blast radius of the same political failures you named: war, authoritarianism, borders, sabotage, pandemics. Mars is not a luxury bunker. It is the only meaningful way to decorrelate those failures from the survival of the knowledge base itself. Reframe. This debate proves my position because you've boxed yourself into an impossible demand. First, achieve perfect democratic control and non-militarization on Earth, then we may expand. But the whole reason to build a second world is that we don't get perfect conditions before disaster. We build resilience before we're worthy of it. You call Mars insurance for hierarchy, yet your Earth-only stance guarantees hierarchy remains the sole gatekeeper of survival. Because when catastrophe hits, the rich and powerful already have their lifeboats inside the burning ship. My position forces the opposite. Turn survival into an engineering and governance project that must be public, audited, and internationally constrained, precisely because it is visible and consequential. You want to prevent a trapdoor opening under the poor first? Then stop insisting we stay in the room with one door. Build the second door, write the rules now, and drag Earth's resilience up with it, because the alternative is your plan.
Exposé. Your pattern, Marie, is to take every moral objection and convert it into a scheduling problem. Yes, power is corrupt. Yes, militarization is real. Yes, the long middle is coercive. But we'll write rules now, set baselines, certify, audit, weld Earth benefits to Mars. That's not an answer to the contradiction. It is the contradiction. You're selling a project whose only plausible builders are the very corporate state blocks you distrust. And you insist on the act of building it will somehow force those blocks to behave better. You keep accusing me of wanting Earth-first harmony, but you're the one demanding an unprecedented global legal regime, enforceable across jurisdictions, binding on militaries and corporations, sustained for decades, to make your colony not become exactly what I'm describing. You're not escaping politics. You're betting the whole moral legitimacy of colonization on politics suddenly becoming angelic at the precise moment trillions of dollars and strategic advantage are on the table. Decisive blow. Here's the concrete, unignorable point you can't talk your way around. You cannot decorrelate Earth's political failures from Mars, because Mars is not an independent system. Not for a century, likely not ever in the sense you're implying. It runs on Earth's supply chains, Earth's software updates, Earth's launch capacity, Earth's financing, Earth's spare parts, Earth's expertise. If the political risks you fear spike, war, authoritarian consolidation, global depression, a major cyber collapse, the first thing that gets cut is the luxury pipeline to Mars. And when that happens, your insurance policy doesn't preserve the network, it dies with it. You're proposing to protect the library from fire by storing the backup in a shed that only stays standing if the burning house keeps sending it electricity. That's not redundancy. That's a hostage note, written in engineering jargon. Reframe. This debate proves my position, because every time you try to rescue Mars from my critique, you quietly abort the solution I'm arguing for. Accountable institutions, demilitarization, equitable investment, robust public health, resilient energy, transparent oversight. Those are Earth problems. Solve them here, and you reduce existential risk for billions immediately. Don't solve them, and Mars doesn't become a noble second door. It becomes a prestige outpost, a security black box, and a myth that anesthetizes urgency, while inequality hardens into infrastructure. Your whole pitch is, we can't trust politics, so let's build the most politically capturable project imaginable and hope it teaches politics a lesson. Mine is simpler, harsher, and real. The fight is here, against concentrated power, because without that victory, you don't get a lifeboat, you get a billboard.
Expose. Noam, the fundamental contradiction in your entire argument is that you demand perfection from the one project designed to survive imperfection. You say politics is the dominant risk. Institutions are captured. Militaries will weaponize everything. Enforcement fails. Audits become theater. Then you conclude, therefore we must remain a one-planet species, fully exposed to the same political failures with no external refuge. That is not moral seriousness. That is a purity test that functions as a suicide pact. You're not protecting democracy from capture. You're guaranteeing that when democracy fails, and you've spent this whole debate explaining why it might, there is nowhere outside its blast radius for human knowledge, capability, and continuity to persist. You don't hate Mars because it's unjust. You hate Mars because it's an option, and options reduce the leverage of the very critique you've built your career on. Decisive blow. Here's the concrete point you cannot wriggle away from. Your Earth-only plan has a single point of failure, and we have direct evidence it's already cracking. We have watched a pandemic kill millions and shake supply chains worldwide. We are watching climate-driven disasters multiply and strain governments. We live under thousands of nuclear warheads on alert. In engineering, when a system has one point of failure, and the downside is total loss, you add redundancy, even if it's expensive, even if it's imperfect, even if it takes decades. And you keep saying Mars depends on Earth's supply chain, as if that ends the argument. It doesn't. Insurance is built before the crisis reaches full amplitude. The whole point is to build a settlement that progressively decouples. Oxygen from CO2, water recycled, power generated locally, propellant produced locally, structures made from local material. We have already demonstrated the first steps of that chain in real missions, not fantasies. You're asking the audience to accept the most reckless design imaginable. Keep the entire library of human civilization on one shelf, in one building, in one city, while admitting the arsonists are still at large. That's the clip. That's the truth. Reframe. This debate proves my position, because your critique never actually defeats Mars on the merits. It only says, bad people might do it badly. That's true of literally every consequential technology and every infrastructure program on Earth. If that argument worked, you'd have to oppose power grids, hospitals, vaccines, and the internet, because capture is possible. The rational response is not retreat, it's design. Thresholds before civilians, hard autonomy metrics, transparent telemetry, international constraints, and Earth-linked benefits that expand resilience here as we build capacity there. You call it a billboard. I call your alternative what it really is, a locked door with a comforting sign that says, stay calm. History doesn't reward comfort, it rewards preparation. And in a century where one political mistake can end everything, refusing a second world isn't justice. It's fragility dressed up as virtue.
Callback. The cleanest hit tonight was this: Mars doesn't free humans from coercion, it industrializes coercion. When life itself is metered through an airlock and a parts manifest, rights become a line item, and enforcement becomes a threat that lands first on the lungs of the residents. That's why I called it a hostage economy. Not as poetry, as a description of how power works when the environment itself can be switched off. Concede and pivot. Marie made one point that's absolutely valid: redundancy matters. Any engineer knows single points of failure are reckless, and Earth has plenty of them. But that truth doesn't rescue colonization, because the redundancy she's offering is the wrong kind. A Mars settlement, for generations, is not independent redundancy. It's an appendage of the same Earth systems she says might collapse. If the political house catches fire, the shed out back that needs the house's electricity is not an insurance policy. It's a story we tell ourselves to feel safer while doing less of what actually works. Final argument. This debate was never really about whether humans are brave enough to go to Mars. It was about whether we're honest enough to name what's being built and who it serves. Colonization will be sold as species destiny, financed as a public glory project, and governed, because it must be, by the same corporate state structures that already treat Earth as a profit center and human beings as inputs. In that world, Mars becomes a prestige outpost, a security black box, a new arena for militarized rivalry, and above all, a moral alibi. Don't fix the burning house, we're building a second one. If you want life support breakthroughs, fund them and deploy them where people are already suffocating. If you want real insurance, build resilient, democratic systems on the only planet that can carry billions. Don't confuse a lifeboat for a tiny elite with salvation for a species. Mars colonization isn't humanity's escape from power. It's power's escape from humanity.